A man walked alone into a remote mountain range in Colombia. He never came back. But 4 days after he disappeared, in a region nearly 90 miles from the nearest living soul, a letter appeared on the table of his campsite. No warning, no explanation, as if it had always been there, and the problem was simply that no one had looked closely enough. Written in his handwriting. Dated a day when he was no longer there. No fingerprints on the envelope. No trace of who brought it. In a mountain range that swallows sound before it finishes leaving your mouth, in terrain most maps don't even register, in a place no human being should have been able to reach at that moment. 3 people read that letter. None of them were ever the same again. One left his field career within 3 weeks. Another spent 2 years unable to work. The third transcribed the contents into an official report collected 48 hours later by agents no one at the university could identify. The report vanished. The geologist vanished. What was written in that letter still has no explanation. None. This case wasn't closed. It was buried. And there's a brutal difference between the two, a difference you're going to feel in every second of this video, in every detail that shouldn't have been possible and happened anyway. If you want to know what was written in that letter, hit like now, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I want to know where the people who have the courage to keep going are coming from. Ernesto Cardenas was 52 years old, with 28 years of fieldwork in Colombia's eastern Cordillera when he disappeared. He wasn't an adventurer. He wasn't an amateur. He was a man who knew that terrain with a precision few human beings build over an entire lifetime. He knew where to step. He knew what to avoid. He knew exactly what those mountains could and could not do to a human body. And even so, Ernesto Cardenas simply wasn't there anymore. The camp was intact. The tent closed from the inside. The flashlight drained as if it had been left on for days. The field notebook open to the last entry steady, controlled handwriting, describing a rock formation roughly 1,000 feet to the northeast. The note ends in the middle of a sentence. No period. No correction. The pen was on the ground less than 4 inches from the notebook, as if it had fallen from a hand that ceased to exist mid-thought. There was no struggle. No sign of disturbance. There was absolutely nothing any investigator could hold, name, or classify within any existing protocol. Only silence. And on the table, the envelope. What was written in those lines does not explain Ernesto's disappearance. It deepens the void. It opens a fracture in what any specialist can process with the tools available to them. And in the chapters ahead, you're going to descend into that fracture as far as it goes. No one knows yet where it ends. Ernesto Cardenas was not the kind of man who disappeared. That sentence sounds simple. It even sounds obvious. But it carries a specific weight once you begin to understand who this man really was, not the bureaucratic profile filled out in missing person reports, not the faded photo that briefly circulated in regional Bogota newspapers, but the real Ernesto, shaped by nearly 3 decades of fieldwork in one of the most hostile and least documented geographies in South America. He was born in 1935 in Bucaramanga, the son of a natural sciences teacher who died too early, and a mother who never understood why her son needed to go so far away to study rocks. But Ernesto went anyway, on a partial scholarship, in debt, with a backpack that weighed more than he could properly carry during his first years in college. He graduated in geology from the Universidad Nacional de Colombia in 1959. And from that point forward built a career his colleagues describe with a word rarely used in scientific contexts: devotion. He did not study the Eastern Cordillera as an object of analysis. He inhabited it. Each field season lasted between 40 and 90 days. He slept on the ground, ate the bare minimum, and devoted every available hour of daylight to mapping, measuring, recording. Measuring, recording. His field notebooks, 23 volumes, over the course of his career, now partially missing from university archives, were described by those who read them as documents of almost disturbing density, not just geological data, observations about how wind moved between rock formations, notes about sounds he heard at night that he could not attribute to any identifiable source, records of visual anomalies on the horizon described with technical precision, without drama, without interpretation, just the raw fact, placed on the page with the same detachment he used to record the mineral composition of a soil sample. Anyone who read Ernesto's notebooks came away with the sense that he was documenting a place that did not behave the way it should. In 1987, Ernesto planned his 32nd expedition to the Eastern Cordillera. The specific destination was a region locally known as La Grieta del Silencio. The Silence Rift, a geological formation in the northeastern sector of the range, roughly 90 miles from the nearest town. From a distance, on clear August days, the rift looked like nothing more than a dark line slicing down the mountain's face, a narrow vertical cut that absorbed light instead of reflecting it, as if the surrounding rock had been pulled apart by something that left no marks along the edges. Locals did not point at it. Their eyes moved past it, as if the act of looking directly was something the body rejected before the mind could decide. The name was not poetic. It was functional. Communities in the region had used it for generations because, according to accounts collected by researchers in the 1970s, any sound produced near that formation was absorbed in a way that did not match normal rock acoustics. Voices did not echo. Shotgun blasts fired nearby sounded like dull snaps without reverberation. One researcher who visited the area in 1974 wrote in an informal report that standing near the rift felt like having your ears plugged from the inside out. Ernesto knew those accounts. He had read every one of them. In his preparatory notes for the 1987 expedition, a planning notebook found in his house after his disappearance and returned to his family years later, with several pages removed, he made direct reference to the acoustic anomaly of the Silence Rift, not with skepticism, not with enthusiasm, with the same clinical neutrality that marked everything he wrote. One preserved sentence from that notebook, reproduced by a family member who read it before it was officially handed over, said something close to this. The absence of echo is not an acoustic phenomenon. It is a property of the place. It must be measured as such. It must be measured as such. He left on September 3, 1987. The expedition was solo, a choice he had made frequently in recent seasons, against university safety protocols requiring at least one companion for expeditions longer than 5 days. Ernesto had obtained an informal waiver based on his record and reputation. No one in the institution had the moral authority to tell him he did not know what he was doing. He did, better than anyone. The base camp was established roughly a mile and a quarter from the Silence Rift, on a gray-yellow stone plateau where low vegetation grew in sparse tufts, permanently bent eastward by the constant wind descending from the ridge. The air carried a specific scent, mineral, cold, with something Ernesto had described in earlier field reports as the presence of depth, a quality he never elaborated on and that no other researcher managed to define differently. Visibility stretched in every direction. The rift was visible less than 1.5 miles away. That dark, motionless line on the mountain's face, without reflection, without its own shadow, simply present. A university research assistant, Rodrigo Palacios, accompanied Ernesto to the access point and helped carry equipment to the plateau. Palacios stayed 2 days, helped set up the basic structure, and returned to town on September 5 as planned. He was the last person to see Ernesto Cardenas alive. What Palacios reported about those 2 days is brief, direct, and unsettling in its normalcy. Ernesto was fine, focused, spoke little, as usual. On the morning of the 5th, before Palacios left, Ernesto drank coffee, checked the measuring equipment, and said only that he had slept poorly because there had been a sound during the night he could not identify. Palacios asked what kind of sound. Ernesto replied that that was the problem. It was not any kind of sound he recognized. Palacios went down. Ernesto stayed. 15 days later, when the maximum expedition window passed without radio contact, the university activated a search team. They reached the camp on September 22 and found exactly what the hook described: the intact campsite, the drained flashlight, the pen on the ground, the notebook open in the middle of an unfinished sentence, and on the aluminum table, the envelope, sealed. No name, no return address, not a single fingerprint across its surface, as if it had been placed there by something that does not press what it touches. What it touches. Inside, the letter, dated September 11, in Ernesto's handwriting, written 6 days after Palacios had descended, in a place where no other human had been. This is not a promise. It is a fact that should not be possible. The letter describes, with technical precision and no sign of fear, something Ernesto encountered at the bottom of the rift. And the description uses a word that does not exist in any geological glossary in any language. The letter was 3 pages long. Not 3 full sheets. 3 pages written on both sides of a sheet and a half of standard field paper. The same type Ernesto used in his expedition notebooks, torn from a pad that was inside the tent, the remaining sheets still attached to the spiral binding. Someone checked. The missing sheets in the pad corresponded exactly to the number used in the letter. That means the letter was written there, at the campsite, using the materials available. What it does not explain is how it got into the envelope. What it does not explain is how the envelope ended up on the table without any member of the search team having seen it, before one of them simply looked down and found it there, resting as if it had always occupied that spot, and the failure had been theirs for not noticing sooner. The envelope lay on the aluminum surface of the field table, a cold sheet, lightly oxidized along the edges, reflecting the morning light with the matte sheen of metal that has spent too long exposed to thin, high-altitude air. Oisiger zasu verfelsafef, refesselverfelbiaf, refels to thin, refessafilf, and arresofin, refens, verfelst f. Against that surface, the white envelope stood out with a clarity several team members later described as unsettling, not because it was large, not because there was anything visually extraordinary about it, but because it looked too clean, too intact, as if the entire environment had aged during Ernesto's absence, and that single object had remained exactly as it was at the moment it had been placed there. The first member of the team to pick it up was Hector Munoz. He was 31 at the time, a surveying technician who had participated in 3 prior search expeditions in the same region. According to colleagues, he had a steady temperament, not prone to exaggeration, the kind of professional who processed difficult situations with a functional objectivity that made him valuable in the field. Hector Munoz was the first to read the letter. And 3 weeks after returning from the expedition, he requested an immediate transfer to an office position in Medellin, and never worked in the field again. He never explained why. In a single documented conversation, given to a regional journalist in 1993, investigating disappearances in the Eastern Cordillera, Hector said only one thing about the letter before abruptly ending the interview. "It's not what's written that disturbs you. It's that what's written could not have been written." Then he stood up, left the room, and never responded to further contact. The second person to read the letter was Dr. Carmen Rios, scientific coordinator of the search expedition and a tenured professor in the Department of Geosciences at the Universidad Nacional. She read it in the field the day after the team arrived. Once Hector finally handed over the envelope, she read it in silence, read it again, folded the pages carefully, returned them to the envelope, and spent the rest of the day working without comment. That night, according to 2 team members present, Carmen Rios did not sleep. She sat outside her tent, her back to the camp, staring fixedly toward the silence rift, that dark, motionless line on the mountain face, visible even in the thin pre-dawn light, like a cut the darkness itself could not fill. She remained there until sunrise. When asked if she was all right, she said yes. When asked about the letter, she said the contents would be included in the official report. They were not. The 4-page report that briefly circulated within the university mentioned the letter in 2 lines. It confirmed it had been found at the campsite and stated it was being forwarded for analysis. No analysis was ever published. No results were shared. Carmen Rios developed severe chronic insomnia in the months that followed and stepped away from academic duties for more than 2 years. When she returned, she never again accepted field expeditions and never mentioned Ernesto Cardenas's name in any documented professional or personal context. The third person to read the letter was the expedition's general coordinator, Dr. Augusto Ferreira. He read it back in Bogotá, 2 days after the team's return. It was Ferreira who transcribed the full contents into a formal, detailed report, complete with technical analysis and scientific context, an 11-page document delivered to the university's rector's office on October 8, 1987. 46 hours later, the report was collected by representatives of a government entity no one at the university could identify with precision. They were not federal police, not military, not any regulatory agency known to have jurisdiction over scientific research or civilian disappearances. They presented credentials. The credentials were accepted. The report was handed over. No one ever returned to provide explanation, follow-up, or protocol. Ferreira was the only one of the 3 who spoke directly about the contents, not in an interview, not in an official document, but in a personal letter sent to a former graduate school colleague living in Argentina, discovered decades later among the recipient's belongings after his death. In that letter, Ferreira described what Ernesto had written. Not all of it, but enough. Ernesto began with the exact date and time. September 11, 1987, 3 a.m. The camp was in absolute silence. The flashlight cast a yellow cone over the aluminum table, and beyond that cone the darkness was total, no gradation. None of the diffuse glow that usually accompanies high-altitude nights even without a moon. A darkness Ernesto described as dense, as if the air beyond the reach of the flashlight had acquired consistency. He described the silence not as absence of sound, but as the presence of something occupying the space where sound should be. He used the word mass. He wrote that the silence had weight, that he could feel that weight shifting around the perimeter of the camp, as if it were circling, assessing, measuring the boundaries with an intention he could not name using any geological, scientific, or human term available to him. After that description, Ernesto wrote the following, reproduced in Ferreira's letter in quotation marks, indicating literal transcription. I went to the rift today. I descended as far as the equipment allowed. What is down there is not rock formation. I know the difference. 28 years have taught me what stone does and what stone does not do. What is down there moves. What is down there moves. Stone does not move. That sentence, simple, direct, devastating, coming from a man who had spent nearly 3 decades studying rock behavior, was followed by 2 additional paragraphs in the original letter that Ferreira did not reproduce. He wrote only, The rest I cannot put into words that would make sense outside the context of being there. I prefer not to try. Ernesto's letter ended with a geographic coordinate. Nothing else. A precise point in the mountain range, noted with absolute technical accuracy. But there was one line before the coordinate. A line Ferreira transcribed into his personal letter without comment, without analysis, without any attempt to explain what it meant. Ernesto had written, "I'm going back tomorrow." He did not return. Geographic coordinates do not lie. That is the foundational principle of any fieldwork in geology, surveying, or cartography. A point in space. It does not change. It does not behave differently depending on who is looking at it. It has no intention, no agenda. It is simply a precise position within a reference system designed to eliminate ambiguity. Ernesto Cardenas understood that better than anyone. That is precisely why the final line of his letter was a coordinate, not a description, not a name, not a plea. A coordinate was the most exact thing a man like him could leave behind. It was the most direct way to say, "Go here. Look here. The problem is here." The problem was that the point indicated by the coordinate did not exist on the maps. Not in the way it should have. The coordinate pointed to a specific sector of the Silence Rift that, according to official geological surveys conducted between 1961 and 1979, the most comprehensive available for that region corresponded to an area of compact sedimentary rock, with no cavities, no relevant fissures, no geomorphological feature that would justify any particular scientific interest. On the maps, that sector appeared as a uniform patch of dark brown, the standard classification for dense, stable rock, the kind of formation an experienced geologist crosses without stopping, because there is nothing there that requires study. A dead zone on paper, closed, inert, without history. Ernesto had descended to that point. That much was clear from the letter. He went down, brought equipment, measured, observed. And what he found did not match what the maps insisted should be there. A Colombian geographer named Pablo Suarez spent years attempting to cross-reference the letter's coordinate with available cartographic data. He published. He was suppressed. He attempted to republish. He was blocked. He tried to present his findings at a conference in Cali in 1995. The presentation was removed from the program 48 hours before the event under an administrative justification that no one signed. Each obstruction happened too quickly to be organic bureaucracy. Organic bureaucracy is slow, disorganized, full of internal friction. What Suarez encountered was precise, coordinated, as if someone were monitoring every attempt in real time and responding before any result could consolidate. He wrote in a personal diary, made public by his daughter after his death in 2011, "I am not being ignored. I am being observed." The cross-analysis Suarez attempted was technically simple but conclusively disturbing. The coordinate Ernesto left pointed exactly to the center of an anomaly the official geological surveys themselves had recorded but never explained. An area of roughly 200 square meters, where subsurface density readings produced values the instruments of the time classified as measurement error because they did not correspond to any known category of rock or sediment composition. It was not a void, not a cave, not a conventional geological fault. It was an absence of data where data should have existed. A region the instruments measured but could not classify, so the standard protocol was to log it as technical failure and move on. No one returned to measure again. No one questioned it. The anomaly was there, visible in the official documents, buried under the label of instrumental error, as if the problem were the equipment and not the place. Ernesto knew it was there. That was the point. He had read the surveys with the depth that only 28 years working in the same region allows, and he had seen what any other researcher would have dismissed as technical noise. He went to verify it. He descended with his own equipment, more modern, more sensitive, and what his instruments recorded at that point, the data preserved in the field notebook entry that ends mid-sentence, was not instrumental error. It was real, it was measurable, and it was impossible within any established geological framework. The field notebook was collected along with Ferreira's report. The raw data Ernesto gathered was never publicly analyzed, but one page was photographed by a member of the search team before the materials were confiscated. A photo taken without authorization, kept for years inside an ordinary envelope in a box of personal papers, unmarked, without context, waiting for someone who would understand what they were looking at. Suarez did. The photograph showed a sequence of numerical readings on yellowed grid paper, the edges slightly warped by high-altitude humidity. Ernesto's handwriting dense and steady as always, and beneath the readings, a single sentence written in noticeably larger script than the rest of the notebook, as if Ernesto had needed more physical space to contain the weight of what he was recording. As if the sentence did not fit within the normal size of the others. As transcribed by Suarez in his diary, the sentence read, "The reading is not wrong. The place has no bottom. On the bottom, honorably, long. The place has no bottom. Honor the Lord. I'm a noble. Honor Lord." A geologist with 32 years of experience, calibrated instruments, rigorous methodology, writing in a field notebook that a specific point in Colombia's eastern Cordillera has no bottom. Not a metaphor. Ernesto did not use metaphors in field notebooks. It was a reading. It was the result of a measurement. It was data, and that data was tied to the coordinate he left on the final line of the letter, written at 3 in the morning on September 11, 1987, at a campsite nearly 90 miles from the nearest inhabited place, in a region where silence has weight, and stone does things stone should not do. The place has no bottom, and Ernesto went there. But there is a detail in the photograph Suarez recorded in his diary that he could not explain, a detail no geological analysis, no research protocol, and no scientific framework available can absorb without collapsing. Below the sentence about the bottom, along the lower margin of the page, written with different pressure, as if added at another time, were 3 words. Suarez transcribed them. He did not comment. He simply wrote them and closed the paragraph. The 3 words were, "It saw me." There is knowledge that does not enter maps. Not because it is imprecise, not because it is primitive or methodless, but because there exists a category of information about certain places that the communities living near them accumulate over generations through a form of observation that institutional science has no protocol to absorb, so it simply does not. It discards it, files it away as folklore, treats it as cultural noise, contaminating objective data, and moves on without looking at what it just threw away. The communities surrounding the Silence Rift knew that place in a way no geological survey ever seriously attempted to document. The closest village to the rift was called Agua Negra, a settlement of roughly 240 people living in adobe and wooden houses scattered along a narrow valley, about 37 miles from the coordinate Ernesto marked. The valley was enclosed on both sides by rock walls that blocked both the morning and afternoon sun, leaving only a narrow window of direct light at midday, a white, almost shadowless light that did not last long and left the place submerged in cold gray for the rest of the day. The houses were low, the walls thick, the windows small, architecture not chosen for aesthetics, but shaped as a physical response to an environment that offers no voluntary comfort. A stream cut through the valley, its water dark, almost black under certain light conditions. The oldest residents said it had been that way for as long as anyone alive could remember. No one drank from it. No one fished in it. Not because of formal prohibition, not because of written law, not because of an explicitly articulated superstition, but because the collective memory of the place had calcified around that behavior in a way that made the alternative unthinkable. Like not putting your hand in fire. There was no debate. There was only the fact. A Brazilian anthropologist named Marcos Vidal visited Iguanigra in 1991, 4 years after Ernesto's disappearance, as part of a broader study on isolated communities in the Eastern Cordillera. Vidal was not investigating the geologist's case. He did not know about the letter, the coordinate, the 1987 expedition. He was documenting cultural practices and oral memory structures in communities with limited contact with urban centers. And what he recorded in Iguanigra without realizing he was documenting something directly connected to a disappearance systematically suppressed for 4 years, is the part of this case that most unsettles anyone who reads carefully. The residents of Iguanigra had their own name for the Silence Rift. They did not use the term adopted by outside researchers in the 1970s. They called it something else, in a regional Spanish expression Vidal transcribed in his field journal as El lugar donde la tierra respira hacia dentro. The place where the earth breathes inward. Vidal logged it as linguistic data and moved on to the next interview. But what residents said about the behavior of that place collected in separate conversations with 11 people of different ages, with no prior coordination between them, with a consistency Vidal himself described as statistically improbable for unaligned oral accounts, was this: the rift absorbs, not just sound, it absorbs presence. Anything that descends beyond a certain point does not return. Not animals, not objects, not people. The collective memory of Iguanigra contained at least 7 episodes, spread across 4 generations, of individuals who had gone too close to the rift and never come back. None of those incidents had been reported to outside authorities. None had triggered official investigations. They were absences absorbed into the memory of the place the same way the stream absorbed light completely, without residue, without reflection. What made Vidal's documentation different from conventional folklore was the technical specificity residents used to describe the phenomenon. They did not say the rift was cursed. They did not speak of spirits, entities, or supernatural forces with intention or consciousness. They described the place as having a physical property like gravity, like temperature, like pressure, a property that increased with depth, and, beyond a certain threshold, became irreversible. The word one of the oldest residents used, according to Vidal's transcription, was umbral, threshold, a point of passage without return. He said everyone in the village knew where the umbral was, and that the unwritten rule, passed from parent to child for longer than anyone could trace, was never to cross that line. Ernesto Cardenas, with all his competence, all his equipment, 28 years of intimacy with that terrain, had crossed it. Vidal published his work in 1993. The chapter on Iguanigra spanned 17 pages and detailed precisely what residents had reported about the rift. The book circulated in academic circles without obstruction. No reports were confiscated. No presentations were canceled. No one intervened, because the name Ernesto Cardenas appeared nowhere in its pages. Vidal did not know. He was describing the place where a geologist had vanished 4 years earlier. He did not know about the coordinate. He did not know about the letter. He did not know that the 17 pages he wrote about the physical properties of a place residence, called The Place Where the Earth Breathes Inward, corresponded with unsettling precision to what Ernesto had recorded in his field notebook and described in his 3 a.m. letter. It was Pablo Suarez who connected the 2 documents in 1994, 2 completely independent bodies of evidence, one scientific, one oral separated by 4 years, and by languages that seemed to share no point of contact, describing the same phenomenon with identical precision. Science said, unclassifiable density, anomaly, bottomless reading, data impossible within established frameworks. 4 generations of oral memory said, threshold, point of no return. They were the same information, and Ernesto had gone there with measuring equipment, had descended beyond the point the residents of Aguanegra knew not to cross, had recorded what he found in a letter written at 3 in the morning in steady handwriting without a single trace of panic, and then he simply was not there anymore. Aguanegra still exists. The houses still have small windows and thick walls. The stream still runs dark along the valley floor. And when outside researchers ask about the rift, the answer they receive is always the same, delivered with a patience that sounds less like explanation and more like a final warning to someone who arrived too late. But what no outside researcher thought to ask, and what Vital discovered only in a hallway conversation on his final day in Aguanegra, recorded in a single line at the end of his field journal without emphasis, as if he himself did not grasp the weight of what he was writing, was this: the residents were not afraid that someone would cross the threshold and not come back. They were afraid of what came back instead. In 2019, 32 years after Ernesto Cardenas disappeared, an independent team of 4 researchers decided to go to the coordinate. They were not geologists. They were independent investigators, 2 journalists specializing in unsolved cases, a retired geographer with field cartography experience, and a Colombian documentary filmmaker named Valeria Ospina, who had spent 3 years assembling fragments of the case from scattered sources, including Pablo Suarez's diary, Marcos Vilal's book, and direct conversations with residents of Aguanegra. Valeria was the one who connected the pieces with enough precision to justify the expedition. She organized logistics, secured equipment, mapped the route, and established a communication protocol with an external contact who would receive updates every 12 hours. They reached the plateau on the 2nd day of hiking. The terrain matched the reports exactly: low vegetation permanently bent eastward by constant wind, gray-yellow stone underfoot, air carrying that mineral, cold scent with no urban equivalent, like breathing something that had never been breathed before. And the rift, visible less than 1.5 miles away, that dark vertical line on the mountain face that reflected no light, cast no shadow of its own, simply existed with a presence the eye registered, but the brain took longer to process. Valeria filmed their arrival, filmed the surroundings, filmed the exact point where, according to the original camp coordinates, Ernesto's aluminum table had stood in September 1987. The retired geographer, identified in documents only as Professor Restrepo, powered on the subsurface density measurement equipment and began working toward the rift. The first readings were normal. The third showed a slight irregularity. The 4th, 5th, 6th, each progressively closer to the exact coordinate, displayed values Restrepo described aloud for the audio recorder in a tone that began controlled and gradually lost that quality. Not dramatically, but the way an experienced professional loses neutrality, when the data increasingly contradicts everything he knows he should be seeing. On the 7th reading, taken roughly 100 feet from the coordinate, the instrument registered the same type of value the official surveys of the 1960s had classified as measurement error. Restrepo did not dismiss it. He recalibrated from scratch, measured again. The value remained. He said into the recorder, his voice completely flat. It's not the equipment. 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 At about 50 feet from the coordinate, journalist Fernanda documented the first communication anomaly. The signal did not drop. Technical indicators confirmed normal output. But the external contact later reported that during that specific interval, no transmission had been received. The signal went out. It did not arrive, as if the space between the device and the satellite had stopped conducting information at that precise location. Journalist Diego wrote in his notebook, "Communication. Output confirmed, reception 0. Same as Ernesto's radio. Same as Ernesto's radio." At roughly 30 feet from the coordinate, the silence changed. Valeria described it in the footage transcript as a shift in the quality of the ambient environment she could not attribute to any identifiable source. There was not less sound. There was a different sound occupying the space where normal sound should be. She used the word wait. The same word Ernesto had used in the letter 32 years earlier. Restrepo took the final reading at about 15 feet from the exact coordinate. The value confirmed what Ernesto had written in his field notebook. The instrument did not detect a bottom, not because the bottom was beyond technical reach, but because, at that point, the reading continued descending without encountering resistance, without any density variation indicating the presence of solid, liquid, or gas within known parameters. The place had no bottom. Exactly what Ernesto had written in 1987. Then Restrepo did something that was not in the protocol. Something he could not explain later, neither in the expedition logs nor in any subsequent conversation. Without warning the others, without announcing it, he shifted the equipment, laterally not toward the rift, not forward, but sideways, less than 10 feet from the original coordinate, and took another reading. The value was different. Not different in the sense of normal. Different in the sense of impossible within any scale. The instrument was calibrated to measure a value beyond the instrument's upper limits. Not because the subsurface was denser, but because the reading indicated presence where there should have been none, 3 meters to the side of a bottomless point. The instrument detected a density corresponding, in Restrepo's later calculations, to a compact mass of indeterminate dimensions positioned at variable depth, as if something were stationary down there. Ernesto had not described that. The letter did not mention it. The field notebook did not record it. None of the documents Valeria had spent 3 years assembling referenced any detectable presence adjacent to the bottomless point. This was new information, a layer that did not exist in any previous record, and it pointed to a possibility none of the 4 team members verbalized in that moment, but which Valeria documented in the final report with an objectivity that cost more than it seemed. If the bottomless point was an opening, the lateral reading suggested something existed on the other side of it. The team did not descend. That was the rule. Document, measure, record do, not descend. They spent 2 more hours in the perimeter, collected everything they could collect, and returned to the plateau camp while there was still enough light to navigate. That night, none of the 4 slept. Each described it independently in the final report. Valeria, Diego, Fernanda, and Restrepo, in separately written sections without consulting one another. All used variations of the same description. There was a sound during the night none of them could identify. It was not wind, not local wildlife. That was the problem. It was not any kind of sound they recognized. The same words Ernesto had said to Palacios on the morning of September 5, 1987. The team returned to town the next day. All 4 returned. Valeria attempted to publish their findings on 3 platforms throughout 2020. 2 declined without explanation. The 3rd published the report for 11 days before removing it with a generic notice bearing no signature. The full report still exists. It is in Valeria Ospina's possession. She no longer attempts to publish it. Ernesto Cardenas was never found. The coordinate is still there. The rift still absorbs sound. Restrepo's lateral reading has never been explained. And beneath the point, a geologist with 32 years of experience, called bottomless instruments, detected something that should not be there. Something stationary. Something with mass. Something at variable depth. No one knows what it is. No one has gone back to verify. If this case is going to stay in your head tonight, and it will hit like now, not for the number, because stories like this only reach the people who need to hear them, when those who already have decided they deserve to keep circulating. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Every case we publish here was chosen because it should not have been silenced, and you'll want to be here when the next one arrives. And now I need to know, what city are you watching from? Tell me in the comments. Because this case happened nearly 90 miles from any inhabited place, at a point official maps classify as measurement error. And I want to know where the people who made it to the end and can still breathe normally are coming from.